Eleanor Rose sat hunched over the polished oak coffee table in the expansive living room of her stepmother's opulent estate. The towering ceilings and vast beige walls, adorned with delicate gold accents, made her feel insignificant, just another shadow swallowed by the space. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting golden patterns across the room, but the warmth never seemed to reach her. The plush, cream-colored sofa stood a few feet away, an inviting island of comfort, but Eleanor found solace in her solitude at the far end of the room. Her mind was laser-focused, navigating the complex web of equations sprawled across the pages before her. Fractions, variables, and numbers, her sanctuary in a world that had never truly embraced her. Today, though, the clarity numbers usually brought her wasn't enough to quiet the storm raging inside. The scent of fresh lilies mixed with the sharp tang of polished wood filled the room. Everything gleamed. Antique vases, the chandelier overhead, the fine china locked away in a glass cabinet, but none of it felt like home. The house wasn't cold because of its design. It was the people who lived within its walls that made it so. Eleanor's mother, Evelyn, a statuesque woman with a cascade of auburn hair and an ever-present air of refinement, had long since moved on from Eleanor's father, who had been kind but distant before his sudden passing. Her mother's new husband, Victor Caldwell, was a man of wealth, status, and a disdain that he barely masked. To him, Eleanor was an unwelcome reminder of a chapter Evelyn had closed long ago. Victor often made sly remarks, always carefully veiled but sharp enough to cut deep. "You should try to fit in more, Eleanor," he'd say with a thin smile. "No one likes someone who makes waves." He never shouted. His cruelty was more sophisticated than that. But each comment was a stone, carefully placed, building a wall between Eleanor and the acceptance she craved. Evelyn, for all her beauty and poise, had grown cold over the years. She wasn't malicious, just absent. Her mind always seemed elsewhere, lost in social events, charity galas, and keeping up appearances. Eleanor had long stopped hoping for her mother's defense against Victor's subtle barbs. Silence had become Evelyn's response of choice, and that silence spoke volumes. "Why can't you just be like everyone else?" Evelyn had once asked, her voice flat, as if Eleanor's uniqueness was a flaw. Eleanor clenched the pencil tighter, the pressure turning her knuckles white. The math problem in front of her, an intricate web of logic and numbers, was her attempt to prove them wrong, to prove herself. But no matter how precise her calculations were, the numbers could never answer the question that burned in her heart. Why wasn't she enough? The next day at school, the usual dullness hung in the air, stale chalk dust, worn-out posters, and the faint buzz of idle conversations. Eleanor sat in the second row, head down, as her classmates trickled in, filling the room with chatter. Mrs. Whitaker, the math teacher known for her ruthless critiques, strode in, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. She was a tall woman, with silver-streaked hair pulled tightly into a bun and a permanent scowl etched into her face. "Today, Mrs. Whitaker announced, we're tackling a problem that most of you will fail to solve. But let's see who's brave enough to try." She scribbled the problem on the board, an elaborate word problem involving ratios and variables that made the entire class groan. Her sharp gaze swept the room and landed on Eleanor. "Miss Rose," she said, her voice heavy with skepticism, "why don't you take a shot?" The classroom went dead silent, then erupted into muffled laughter. Eleanor could feel the heat rise in her cheeks. They all thought the same thing. Quiet, invisible Eleanor couldn't possibly solve it. But something inside her cracked. A quiet, fierce resolve. "I'll try," Eleanor said, surprising even herself. Mrs. Whitaker's eyebrows arched in surprise, but she stepped aside, gesturing toward the board with a dismissive wave. Eleanor's hands trembled as she picked up the chalk, but her mind was razor-sharp. The complex numbers, intimidating to the others, lined up in her mind like obedient soldiers. She blocked out the whispers, the stifled giggles, and even the echo of Victor's sneering voice in her head. You'll never be enough. She pushed the thought away. Her hands moved faster now, solving for variables, balancing equations, simplifying fractions. The board filled with a flurry of numbers and symbols until she finally circled the answer. 48, she said, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. A heavy silence fell over the room. Mrs. Whitaker, now wide-eyed, examined Eleanor's work line by line. A flicker of shock crossed her face, quickly masked by her usual sternness. She's right, Mrs. Whitaker muttered, almost reluctantly. The class exploded into whispers. Whoa, she nailed it. I didn't think she had it in her. Eleanor returned to her seat, her heart still racing. The moment felt surreal. She had been invisible for so long, overlooked and underestimated. But now, for the first time, she was seen. The following weeks at school were different. Classmates who had barely acknowledged her now smiled as she passed. Some even asked for help on their assignments. It was strange, this newfound attention, but not unwelcome. Eleanor wasn't used to being wanted, to having value in the eyes of others. Mrs. Whitaker, though still strict, seemed to hold a begrudging respect for her now. The sarcastic comments lessened. Occasionally, she even called on Eleanor to explain problems to the class. Yet at home, nothing had changed. Victor's sneers continued. You think you're special now, huh? He scoffed one evening when Eleanor returned home with a perfect test score. A classroom trick won't get you far in the real world. Evelyn barely glanced up from her tablet. Victor, she chided lightly, but her voice was hollow, lacking any real defense. Eleanor clenched her jaw, refusing to let the sting show. She had begun to realize something vital. She didn't need their approval. Her worth wasn't determined by Victor's disdain or her mother's indifference. She had proven it to herself. Eleanor's transformation at school became undeniable. She started answering questions in class, leading group projects, and even tutoring a few classmates who had once dismissed her. The same kids who used to whisper behind her back now praised her. But more importantly, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. Confidence. It wasn't loud or boastful. It was quiet but steady, like a small flame that refused to go out, no matter how many times life tried to snuff it. Victor's harsh words still came, but they no longer pierced as deeply. Evelyn's distance still hurt, but no longer defined Eleanor's worth. She had found her own voice. The final turning point came during the school's annual academic competition, a public event where students solved complex problems in front of parents, teachers, and the local community. Mrs. Whitaker nominated Eleanor. Victor laughed when he heard. Don't embarrass yourself, he sneered. But Eleanor didn't listen. On the day of the competition, the auditorium buzzed with excitement. Eleanor stood on stage, chalk in hand, as the moderator read out the final question, a problem that left even the brightest students scratching their heads. Eleanor, however, didn't falter. She worked through the problem methodically, her mind clear and calm. When she finally circled the answer, the room fell into stunned silence, then erupted into applause. Victor, sitting stiffly in the audience next to Evelyn, looked as if he'd swallowed something bitter. Evelyn, for the first time in years, actually clapped. It wasn't a miracle. It didn't fix everything, but it was something. Later that night, back in the cold, marble-tiled house, Eleanor sat by herself, the weight of the evening still settling in. Victor hadn't said a word on the drive home, and Evelyn had retreated to her room almost immediately. But Eleanor didn't need their validation anymore. She had her own. She was enough. And for the first time, she felt it.